Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Stephen Joseph Palacini. I'm a regulated Canadian immigration consultant. As I mentioned before, the goal of this channel is to provide all the knowledge that I've amassed over the years of practicing as a regulated Canadian immigration consultant and being in the immigration industry, to pass that on to applicants who are self-represented and want to come to me for application reviews, or who want to come to me for representation, or any of the few trusted colleagues that are out there. But my goal is really to provide you guys with the value and show you what it takes for the application, how to do the application yourself, where the officer is going to be looking, clear up myths and truths about IRCC, misconceptions, CBSA, all those misrepresentations that you see on a lot of other, let's say, YouTube channels or with other consultants or agents. So today, I'm specifically going to be talking about, it's kind of the part two to the Canada-Colombia Free Trade Agreement. So now the applying for the work permit process, based upon demand from my viewers. Also, I should mention that this is applicable to a lot of other closed work permit applications from within Canada with minor nuances, okay? I'm going to use the example of somebody who's gotten an LMIA Exempt job offer from their employer under the Canada-Colombia Free Trade Agreement, but it's going to be very similar to a Peruvian who had a job offer under the Canada-Peru Free Trade Agreement. It's also going to be very similar with some differences to somebody who has an LMIA supported job offer and they want to apply for their own closed work permit application, or they want to make sure their consultant's doing everything correctly, right? They want to say, hey, look, I watched SJP Immigration. I watched Stephen Palacini talk about, the work permit issuance prohibitions. And I don't think you've given enough evidence to show the officer that I can perform the work sought. So this is, I want to arm you guys with the knowledge. I believe that I will do some videos later on the channel talking about my opinions on Canadian immigration, where things are going. I'll do some more promotional content as well. But for now, today, and this video is going to be just about the closed work permit application, and it's going to be for somebody from within Canada. Okay, so and the reason I chose to do it from within Canada is because the viewers are typically, they've gotten employer support from within Canada. Their PGWPs are expiring and they found this LMIA exemption that they qualify for, and their employer is willing to support them. So first of all, the target audience, most of them are already within Canada. I'd also say that people who are overseas are less likely to have employer support, right? It's hard enough for Canadians to find a job right now. And if you're a foreign national, it's even harder to find a job when you're overseas. And likely, if you are applying from overseas, you've already dealt with a recruiter who likely is tied up with an immigration consultant and charging exorbitant amounts for the job offer, which is illegal, unlawful, and I've talked a lot about that on my channel as well. So I'm going to be doing this for the people who are in Canada, so consider this: you're in Canada, you're on work status, okay, so either PGWP, or you're able to work because you're working part-time for that employer right now and you're on a study permit and you're going to be changing your conditions. It's the same form, okay? So it's a worker inside Canada application. Extend or change conditions. It's the same form, 5710, okay? So let's get to it. So I forget in the last video talking about the Canada-Colombia Free Trade Agreement, what occupation we specifically chose for one. So let's look at the work permit. I recently got one approved actually for, let's say, a construction estimator. So how that would look as a construction estimator, how you go analyzing the knock, how you go proving now on the work permit application, how you're qualified for the job. So in part one, I talked a lot about what from the employer side, what you got to do. Now I'm going to be talking about from the applicant side, right? So now you're armed with the knowledge to convince your employer that this is something they can do, that it only costs $230, that you can get a work permit valid for 3 years if that's how long the offer is. And now we're going to do your work permit application process, okay? So let's start from IRCC Secure Account. Let's say you have gotten, so your employer's done part one, you have an A number, okay, which is your LMIA Exempt offer number, and your job offer's been submitted to the employer portal. I will say that, I don't know where it is on their website, but I have seen this, that the offer of employment is only valid for 60 days, okay? So, which means that you should submit your work permit application within 60 days of your employer submitting your offer and paying the compliance fee. So do that within 60 days. Make sure you submit your work permit within 60 days, which also means there might be some things you have to get for your work permit that might take a little bit of time. Maybe you need to do an IELTS, right? Maybe you need to get some documents from back home that can prove you can do the work, okay? So let's go to IRCC Secure Account. Let's not waste any time. Let's do, okay, GC key. Again, my lovely fake GC key account as if I'm an immigrant. So I'm going to delete this application. That was from a previous video I was doing. Let's apply to come to Canada. And you're going to be applying for a visitor, study, or work permit because we're applying for a work permit, okay? What would you like to do in Canada? Well, work. How long are you planning to stay in Canada? More than 6 months, okay? Select the code that matches the one on your passport. I said we're doing this for a Colombian. Current country or territory of residence. I'm doing it for a Colombian who's living in Canada. This is just, depending on your country of residence, it's going to bring up different forms, right? It's going to bring up 1295, which is the work permit from outside the country, or it's going to bring up IMM 5710, worker from within the country. And the one that matches the code on your passport, that is going to affect your some parts of your checklist, okay? So do you have a family member who's a Canadian citizen? Let's say no, because now it's probably thinking about some kind of adaptability factors or eligibility that could impact what type of applications you could apply for. I'm going to do this for an adult. Let's say born 1990, January 1st. And no, not a lawful U.S. The reason they're asking that is because green card holders have visa-free entry to Canada. What is your current immigration status? This is for somebody who's currently working. I'm going to say they're a PGWP holder, or they could be a student and they're working part-time and they're not eligible for a PGWP and they want to get a work permit, right? An employer-specific work permit. So let's do worker. And this would be no. These are all the public policies, essentially. Let's say you do have a spouse. This might be yes. It's going to give you the option to apply for an open work permit, right? If your spouse is working in, has a work permit that's longer than yours right now, you can tie up to theirs. But we're going to do, this is a closed work permit application based upon your job offer. Have you been told you're approved in principle? No. This is for the BOWP, Bridging Open Work Permit. Have you applied? No. Do you have a written job offer? This is yes, okay? Because it is considered a written job offer. If I go back and select no, it's not going to give us the option, I don't think, to apply for a work permit. Let's do this for somebody who's single. And province or territory, let's do it for somebody in Ontario. So, yeah, okay. Yeah, you know you need a temporary resident visa if you're, Colombian. And, pardon me, to enter Canada. And work permit in Canada. You may be eligible to extend your stay. Okay, great. This is where I can change it. So, let's go to, I wanted to say, do you have a written job offer? If I say no, right? Do you have a valid, this is trying to feed you through the vulnerable open work permit category, which I can do another video on that later. No. Yeah, so it's saying you're not eligible to apply for a work permit now because you don't have a job offer. You don't actually need, it doesn't need to be written. It just needs to be submitted through the employer portal, technically. Not user-friendly. Let's go back, say yes, we have a written job offer. Okay, so you're applying for a work permit. Are you accompanying a family member who has status in Canada? Let's say No, because we said single. When does your status in Canada expire? This is whether you're going to need to restore or you're going to get on maintained status. So which option best describes your work situation? So this is interesting. What would you put for Canada, Colombia? I believe it's an international agreement. I do need to I want to double check. I'm applying for an employer-specific work permit with LMIA exemption. They should both be kind of the same. But let's see here. Yes. I'm applying for an employer-specific work permit or an international agreement. So let's see what checklist it gives us here. Have you had one? Let's say no. And you're not going to work in one of these categories because you're a construction estimator. So, no. 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 Yes. You can see the you can use the biometrics test tool to make sure your biometrics are still valid. So there's the link to it, and you can check to see if you need to get biometrics again. But likely you do have biometrics. If not, then you'd have to click no and you get biometrics. So this is what they want on the checklist here under an LMIA exemption, which is 5710. Offer of employment, passport, invitation letter. I have no idea why they're asking for an invitation letter. Digital photo, proof that you meet the requirements of the job being offered. So that is, they're asking for 5 supporting documents, 1 application form, and some optional documents. The IMM 5802 is a form that your employer only needs to get if they're unable to submit your application through the employer portal, okay? Let me try and use an international agreement and see if that impacts, because it is an international agreement. And I want to see how that's going to impact your... See, we don't have this kind of granularity with the authorized representative portal. So here, it got rid of the invitation letter. So I'd probably rather do this, because if you highlight over the question mark on the invitation letter, it's like somebody who's inviting you to come to Canada. That's just not really relevant. So offer of employment. This is, you must provide a job offer from the employer who wants to hire you. This is also not entirely true. The employer's already given you the job offer, okay? The employer's already given you the job offer when they've submitted your offer of employment through the employer portal. And I'll show you where that is. So here's this checklist. And I'll start zooming in on these so you can see them a little bit better. But, yes, okay, 5710, that's consistent. There's no rep needed, no authority, no statutory declaration of common law union because you didn't say you're in a common law relationship. Proof of payment, that's irrelevant because you're going to be paying when you submit. Passport pages, okay, these things that they want to see, as I've mentioned over and over again, you want basically any marked page, any page that has any discernible information in your valid passport. And if you want in your client information, you can include older passport that shows good travel history or valid visas that you currently might hold in that older passport, right? Because you might have an old passport that has your TRV that's valid until 2030, but it's a Canadian document. You should show that to the officer. They should see that, okay? And I would put that in client information. And I didn't see somebody comment and say you can only put 1 file in client information. Yeah, but you can also merge multiple files into one single PDF and just reduce it down to less than 4 megabytes and you'll have no problem. Oftentimes my client information has like 10 different types of information sometimes in larger, more complicated business immigration files. We're talking, I include a screenshot of their valid biometrics, or in there I'll have proof of funds, or in there I'll also put in proof of ties, sometimes to their home country. old passports, travel history. I've also put into client information like their spouse's work permit or other things like that. Okay. So I'm not sure why they're asking for an invitation letter. That's not a requirement. If you go look at this document checklist, which arguably, yeah, it's only been updated since 2017. Am I looking at the right document checklist? Worker in Canada applicant. Yeah, I believe this is the most recent relevant one. We can go check by IRCC, apply for work permit. This is how you can get to all these packages. How to apply inside Canada. No. Okay, yes, you have a valid. No. Read the instruction guide. This is, yeah, telling you how to fill out this form. So guide 5553. Okay. It's going to tell you how to answer these questions on the work permit form. But I'm looking for, I want to keep this because that's a relevant guide. There's your check biometric status tool. There it is, 5556. Interesting. Yeah, see? So this is why you want to avoid using Google like I did, because I don't know what multi-screen site is. This is likely the more updated one. October 2023. So always, I just showed you why, like I did preemptively search for this on Google, right? You want to go to and be using the most recent version. So you can also go to IRCC forms. I'm using Google, but this is at their domain, canada.ca. I'm looking for a form or a checklist, and we know that it's 5556. And date modified October 2023, okay? That was good. That was good to show you what mistakes can happen, right, for self-represented applicants. So let's go over to here. This is the checklist that they're requesting. And I will... Okay, so we've got application to change. We're going to do that form. This is not applicable. This is not applicable. This is not applicable. Proof of payment. They're still asking for it in October 2023, but that is, you're paying when you submit the application. Photocopies of passport pages, that's the same thing that's on their, we would do that, and you can see that that's what they recommend here. So they want passport, click the question mark, your valid travel document. That's why you don't need to use old passports, but I like to include information in old passports sometimes if it can make the application stronger, right? Like if you are applying for a visa and you're overseas, I like to show that, hey, the person has a US visa, or the person has an Australian visa, or they had a valid Schengen visa. So, yep, they say the same thing, changes of date, birth, markings, the biodata page essentially. Let's go back over to here. Photocopy of your travel or identity document. If you did not use a passport, that's not applicable. I've never done an application where somebody doesn't have a passport. Photocopy of your current immigration document if you have one. Well, interesting, because they don't have that here on the checklist. Okay? So they want you to use the online checklist, but they also have the paper-based checklist. But yes, it would be important to establish that you are right now able to work in Canada, or, you have a study permit and you are working part-time, like you have valid status in Canada. So I would definitely want to include that in your client information, okay? So you kind of have to take, I would say, when you're doing an application with IRCC, because they have such technical issues and glitches, I would take from both sources and watch my YouTube videos and go through it yourself, okay? and make a judgment call. Say, yeah, it would make sense to include the current immigration document. And what does that mean? That's like your current immigration, your status document in Canada. So that's either your work permit, your study permit, or even your visitor record. Okay. Because you're allowed to, become a worker from visitor status until 2025 sometime. So I would include that of your current work permit or study permit. And recently had a question on my YouTube channel about like, would I include my TRV or my work permit? Include both, but include the work permit first in the order of the client information, because that's considered an immigration document. It's what grants you status in Canada. The TRV doesn't grant you status. The TRV is the visa. It's what allows you to come into the country. But I understand why it's confusing, because a lot of other countries use the term visa. Like in the US, they say work visa, right? They don't say permit, really, or at least from what I've heard. And other countries will say, yeah, entrepreneur visa, e-visa, residence visa, whereas visa in the Canadian context just means like the thing that lets you enter, or I shouldn't say grant you or let you enter, but you still have to go through examination. But it's what would allow you to come into the country. Photocopy of your marriage license, if applicable. That's why it's not applicable to this guy, because he's single. And if you're the dependent of another applicant, provide the UCI of your family member who's the principal applicant. So this is now why I said earlier in the client information, I've put multiple documents, and why I would sometimes put like somebody's spouse's work permit, because their work permit or their TRV or their, let's say, status document, study permit, includes their UCI. And in this case, where it's a dependent, it's not relevant, but this is why you would need to put it into the client information sometimes, right? So this is kind of like an all-encompassing checklist, not just for a closed work permit, but for an open work permit, a spousal open work permit. This is for a bridging open work permit. It's a generic just worker in Canada document. So in this case, the guy's single, so he doesn't have to. But if he did, and was a dependent, which in this case it's not, because he's the principal applicant applying for this closed work permit, it's not necessary to think about including that. Now, if your employer obtained a labor market impact assessment, which they didn't, provide a copy of the LMIA and a copy of your employment contract. So when you submit an LMIA-based work permit, you need to include like a written job offer contract, like, hey, and they have a template online as to what that needs to contain. You need to include the job offer, like the contract itself, and the LMIA from Service Canada. But in this case, it's LMIA Exempt, so they must provide you with the offer of employment number. And they don't, if your employer is exempt from the employer compliance regime, you must provide a copy of the employment contract. But they're likely not exempt from the employer compliance regime. So this is for people who don't need to use the employer portal, okay? So this is an international missions, an international organization, a foreign government, an owner. This is not it. You're not getting an employer compliance fee exemption. It's not, it's a trade international agreement. It's not any of these things, okay? And what this basically means is, now going back to the Canada-Colombia Free Trade Agreement, you don't actually have to include a written employment contract or job offer. What's considered the job offer is the offer of employment number. All the details that the employer put through the employer portal is your contract, is your job offer. In that, they talk about your job details, your rate of pay, your vacation, your benefits, right? Your location of work, which would be present on a written job offer. So you don't need to submit with a written job offer. Okay? But you can include it if you have one. And it's consistent with what was submitted through the employer portal. If you're working in the province of Quebec, I don't do immigration for Quebec. I can't. I'm not registered with the MFI. If you do not submit a medical exam, there may be restrictions on your work permit. So this is, again, if you will need a medical exam if you're working in some occupations, like early childhood development, like you're close to children or you're in the health sciences field. Okay, but construction estimator, you're not going to need to do a medical exam. If you're unsure, if you're like, okay, well, I'm a licensed practical nurse, is that considered health sciences? It's considered allied health professional, right? Or technician. It's kind of uncertain, right? I would say in the case, if you want to have no restrictions on your employment in that regard, you could go ahead and get a medical exam, but they do cost money, right? But for a construction estimator, you do not need one. And you do not need one if you've not been living in a country where you need to over the last 6 months, right? Proof indicating you meet the requirements of the job being offered. So they did include this in the checklist, okay? The online checklist, which is great. Proof you meet the requirements of the job being offered. And I'm going to show you what kind of proof you can use. Proof of education, work experience, mandatory certifications for the occupation of your intended province, language ability, proof of relationship, that's for intercompany transferee, so not in this case, proof of reciprocity, or significant economic benefits. That would be like for the ones that I love doing, C10, C11, C12, also now C61. So you're not an IEC, so this doesn't matter. If you're a graduate of post-secondary school, this is now they're going down through the PGWP. If you're a student, yeah, you should be. If you are a student, right? Let's say this person's studying right now. You should show that you're actively studying right now, including your study permit, right? So they want that for the last 2 periods of study. But this is mostly for the PGWP scheme. If you're a provincial nominee, in this case, you're not. So this doesn't matter. You're not a CSQ holder. We're not doing Quebec. And this is if you're a family member of a work permit holder or of a principal applicant authorized, this would be for like open work permit, evidence that you're a spouse of a common law partner, full-time student. Well, they're going to have to change this soon because no longer can spouses, right, unless it's master's or PhD, come over. Refugee claim, unenforceable removal order. Okay, none of this is really relevant. So what matters is basically just now this. Yeah, proof of meeting, that's where we were off last. So let's go look back to here and say, okay, what are you going to put in the offer of employment? Well, you're going to put the A number that your employer gave you. That can be, I'd say that can be presented in 2 ways. A screenshot from the submitted offer of employment in the employer portal, which I could log into the employer portal and show you where they could find that, or the email that the employer would get from do not reply at cic.gc.ca that's going to show your offer of employment's been submitted, the A number is A, blah, 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 blah. I would want to show that here in the offer of employment category. I also like to include the proof of payment. It doesn't mention it in the checklist, but for 2 years, they've been having issues with issuing official payment receipts in the employer portal. So I always get my employers to screenshot once they've made payments through the Moneris platform. So then I basically, in this offer of employment section, or for the APR, it's in client information, I put it on basically 3 separate types of information. It's applicable for startup visa as well, and C11 and any other LMIA exempt job offer. I show the screenshot from the employer portal because then you can see the employer's name and all that, and it has the A number. I include from the email, a PDF copy of the email from do not reply at cic.gc.ca, and I highlight in yellow the offer of employment number. And I also put a screenshot of the proof of payment. Okay, so that the employer's paid $230, so that they don't think they're exempt from the employer compliance regime. That way, I've never had any issues showing all that. I also believe that if you don't submit it with a receipt, you should be okay. It's not mandatory. It's not mandatory on the checklist, but it's probably a good idea to include it if you can. Okay, so that's your offer of employment basically. And you could even put a one paragraph description. I always love to try and do the job for the officer. So basically say, has the employer submitted a complete LMIA exempt offer of employment, reference A number, and paid the employer compliance fee directly? Yes, proceed to step 4. So that's what's considered the offer of employment, right? And what I'm saying here is I'd like to put a little paragraph where I'd say, like, if you want to really impress the officer, is you would say, as per checklist IMM 5556E, you could even put a link to it. And if you wanted, you could then screenshot this. Employer is exempt from obtaining an LMIA under the Canada-Colombia Free Trade Agreement, and there's the offer of employment number. Like, I've provided it to you. And you don't need to provide, you must provide a copy of the employment contract if it's exempt from the employer compliance regime. It's only exempt from the employer compliance regime if you're not paying $230, which in many cases, that's not the case. Those are only for very strange cases. So that is what you could include there at a bare minimum. Okay, bare minimum. Then we've got, and I'm going to talk about how you can then make your application stronger. But bare minimum, you would include that. Passport, okay, that's pretty self-explanatory. And the requirements are here. Digital photo, yeah, you need to get a digital photo as per these temporary resident specifications. It should be less than 6 months or less than a year old. I'm not quite 100% certain, but I think it should be less than a year. And proof you meet the requirements of the job being offered. This is, it depends on the position. So you're going to have to go, depending on what you have your job offer in and what you're being hired to do and what your profile looks like. I'll show you how you can evaluate that. So let's talk about how proof you can meet the requirements of the job. Also, this is why you're going to want the employer to provide you with a copy of what they submitted through the employer portal, or be working with a consultant who knows what was submitted. But in the employer portal, they have the ability to put in job details. They have the ability to put in credentials required. So let's just say hypothetically you're getting hired as a plumber, and they put on the offer that, like, you need to be a Red Seal plumber, right? Or a Red Seal electrician. You need to have that credential. You best believe that you got to show that on your work permit application, okay? If they're hiring you in a position that requires communication in the English language, you have to show that you can communicate in English, which usually means IELTS or CELPIP, right? Especially if you're from a country where the primary language is Spanish. So this will vary, the proof will vary depending on the job. But let's go look for the knock for, actually I want to keep this link up. No. So this is where ability to perform the work sought. So completion of secondary school is required. Now, if you've graduated from a Canadian institution, or like I said, you're studying in Canada, you would want to include that you can include those credentials from Canada, right? If you don't have a Canadian education credential, they don't really know what qualifies as high school in Colombia, right? So ideally, you would include like an ECA, an Education Credential Assessment. You would include like a WES from World Education Services that shows that you have a 2-year diploma or at least a secondary school, because they're saying is required. So if they're not convinced that you have a high school education, they could refuse this work permit application. Okay? Completion of a 3-year college program in civil or construction engineering technology, or several years of experience as a qualified tradesperson in a construction trade are required. So, if you have a university degree from Columbia, or you have at least a 3-year college program in civil or construction engineering, or I'd say like very similar to that, then you'd want to emphasize that with a WES. Okay? Can you just get your transcripts translated and try and convince the officer? I mean, you could, but if they're having a bad day and they really want to be sticklers on it, they don't have to evaluate it. Like, that's the job of WES. That's the job of getting the ECA. So I would say they're valid for 5 years. Just go ahead and get it done. Okay? Because then they can't argue on the fact that you don't have the equivalent of a bachelor degree, right? Or a 3-year college program. Now, they also say, or several years of experience. So let's say you didn't have a 3-year college program in civil or construction engineering, but you have several years experience as a qualified tradesperson in plumbing, carpentry, electrical are required. In many cases, you might not have that several years of experience in Canada. You might have the experience at Tim Hortons as a food service supervisor, or at Walmart as a cashier. So, because these are highly regulated occupations. But if you did work for 3, 5, 7 years in Colombia as a carpenter, right? In a particular trade, qualified tradesperson, then you're going to want to prove that. How? Reference letters. And do they have to write the reference letter in English? Not necessarily. But if they write it in Spanish, you're going to have to get it certified translated. Okay? So these have pretty strict employment requirements. And certification by Canadian Institute of Quantity Surveyors is usually required. That's interesting. They say usually, they don't say is or are required. So I've seen them be approved without anybody having the Canadian Institute of Quantity Surveyors. Okay? But if you did have that certification, or it's relatively easy for you to get, you might want to consider getting it, because it might actually add points in your express entry if it is a COQ, Certificate of Qualification. I don't believe it is, but that's an example of where if you had that, you would want to include that. Now, it doesn't also mention here that the employment requirements include being able to communicate in English, but that's why we go look in here, which is my best friend, and I say that all the time, are these basically the operational instructions and guidelines. So, is the foreign national eligible to be issued a work permit? So, will you leave Canada? Are you allowed to apply where you did? Are you eligible for work permit? So, yeah, it's this labor market exemption. Do you meet the requirements, including a medical exam if applicable? Let's say you are eligible, right? Are there any factors prohibiting work permit? Are there reasonable grounds to believe the foreign national cannot perform the work sought, including meeting the language requirements? That's why assessing language requirements. They will not believe you can perform the work sought if they do not believe you can speak English. So they talk about this, how described in the LMIA, but see, there's no separate standard or criteria at NOC C or D in the intended occupation. It is quite subjective, okay? It can be assessed through an interview or official testing. Should refer to the LMIA requirements. This is why it's not talking about LMIA exemptions, but you still should show that you can communicate in English. So IELTS exams are good for 2 years. You would use it. Do you definitely need to include an IELTS? No. I've seen them approved without IELTS. But it again, that's where it depends on the applicant's situation. If you've studied in Canada and you're on a PGWP, you probably could get away without an IELTS exam. Because do you think the officer is going to believe you can't speak English if you went to a school or a college for 2 or 3 years in Canada? I mean, they still could, right? Do you want to give them any potential reason to refuse? Whereas if, let's say, and this wouldn't apply, but if you're applying from outside the country, or you didn't study in Canada and you're just applying straight from like visitor to this work permit, yeah, I would say they're gonna want to see some IELTS or CELPIP. Don't need a CAQ, strike breaker. No. Have you engaged in unauthorized work or study? Does the offer not comply with? So they're basically checking here for LMIA exempt work permit applications, Canada Colombia Free Trade Agreement. Does the offer of employment not comply with all federal provincial agreements? So does it fall under an eligible knock, right? Now, there is a section in the employer portal where when your employer submitted the job offer, it says how you meet the LMIA exemptions. It's an optional document they can include. But if you really want to be safe and secure and in control of your own application, you could include this in your client information, how you meet the requirements of the LMIA exemption. And how would you do that? Well, you go to the Canada Colombia Free Trade Agreement. I think I said this in the other one, but you go Canada Colombia FTA. Here it is. They give you no information, but you could print this out and say it says to look at the occupations that are in almost identical to Chapter 12 of the Canada-Peru FTA. So you could print that out, highlight that, then you go point the officer to Peru, professionals or technicians, and you go and you find construction estimator. And you highlight this and you print this page. So you say, look, it's, yes, this is the Canada-Peru, but the occupations are the same. Basically, you find it where it is on their, let's say, operational instructions and guidelines. So you can then prove to them, say, hey, this is how I meet the exemption requirements, right? For employer specific, has the employer not provided the offer of employment and or not paid the employer compliance fee? Well, you provided the offer of employment with the A number and the employer compliance fee. That's why I said you should include the receipt, but you don't need to, because if you provide the offer of employment, everything's fine on their back end, they'll see that the employer paid. But why leave anything to chance if you haven't started the process yet? And you can go ahead and tell your employer, hey, make sure you just screenshot proof of payment. Striptease, erotic dance, okay? For example, an accountant working for a strip club. Has the employer received a negative determination? This is like if they're on the negative employers list, they're doing nasty things. And admissibility, so misrepresentation, other things. No, issue a letter of introduction. So that is like the final thing they're doing, right? And that's it. So this is the steps they go to approve your work permit application. So I've pretty much gone through a lot. I hope I showed you guys enough, right? From where you can find these things, what you should look for, what to watch out for. Now, to summarize, what would I have for these documents? Any proof they meet the requirements of the job being offered from the NOC code. And you can also sometimes in an explanation letter or a submission letter, print out the NOC, right? That's what I did in several of my previous applications. I print out the NOC and I highlight. I say, look, it requires this. They have that. They exceed that. Or it's a technical position and they speak CLB7 English, which is a very good user of the language. So where it's not always clear in the NOC, yeah, you want to maybe include English here, proof that you can speak the language required for the job, proof that you meet those NOC requirements. So that's proof of your education. If you don't want to leave any questions, WES if it's foreign education. Also, that could proof you meet the requirements could be work experience, which comes in the proof of work reference letters. Do you need to include pay stubs that you actually worked for those 3 years? That's going really far. You're not trying to prove here Canadian work experience or federal skilled work experience for a PR application. But, you know, if you have those documents readily available, why not include them if you can? Show that you were paid for that work, and because now you're showing another piece of evidence, which is like you were paid and you have the reference letter and they match up, right? How long you worked for them. Or tax documents that showed you worked in that occupation. Maybe your country, you put in your title that you're doing. So that's what you want to show in proof you meet the requirements. Digital photo, that's self-explanatory, like I said. And I've said this before, but you can take this on your own with a digital camera, but you can also just go to like London Drugs or Shoppers Drug Mart and get one done. Passport, any pages that have any markings, any visas, any name changes, any bio data, any family information should be included. And if you want to include old passports with valid visas, or old passports even that show travel history, you could include that in client information. And why would you want to show travel history? Well, let's go back to where we saw the work permit issuance prohibitions. One of the main things is, will you return to your home country? Where was that? Will the foreign work national leave Canada after their temporary stay? Because this is a temporary application, right? It's not permanent residence. So you already do have a visa for this person. They're already in Canada. I would say they're not going to be looking at this too challenging, as if somebody from overseas they would be. But why not include travel history? If you've got travel history to the US, Mexico, Schengen area, included in client information to say, hey, look, I've traveled and I've been a good boy. So that's that. You could include that. And that's pretty much it. So, and the offer of employment, like I said, at a minimum, I include screenshot from the portal. I could log into the employer portal and show you how to find that, but employer logs in, it's under submitted offers of employment, or they got an email from do not reply at cic.gc.ca with the A number, but just include that A number on a Word doc, amend the payment receipt to it as well. And finally, where you can talk about how you meet the LMIA exemption requirements, that could also be put in either proof you meet the requirements of the job or client information, which is where I said you're taking the information from the Canada-Colombia FTA. You're saying, hey, look, they referenced me to the Canada-Peru FTA. These are the occupations. It says right here, point blank, construction estimators. Then you go and you print off the NOC. You say, construction estimators. Yes, qualifies. Why? It's tier 2. It's a technical occupation. It falls under the technicians list. You could be very wordy and keep going on. But that would give you like zero chance of getting it refused. Now, 5710, let's not do what I did at the beginning. Let's go, where do we find that form? 5710. I'm just going to roughly go through how to fill this bad boy out. This is just like my YouTube video on bridging open work permit application, although there will be some things that are different. UCI, Universal Client Identifier, of course, you know where to find that. That is found in your on your visa. It's found on your work permit. It's an 8 or 11-digit number. It stands for Universal Client Identifier. English, what are you doing here? Are you applying for a work permit with the same employer? That would be if you're already on a closed work permit with that employer and you're basically applying for, a work permit with the same employer. I'm doing this under the impression of somebody on a PGWP or on a study permit that's working part-time, and now they, so it would be apply for a work permit for the first time or with a new employer, right? So you can have multiple, right? You can have apply for a work permit and restore. So you can have multiple selections on this form. That would be if you're out of status right now and you need to restore your status as a worker and pay the additional fee. This is a temporary resident permit. That's a whole other application. But for many people, it's going to be apply for a work permit for the first time or with a new employer. But if it is with the same employer and you're just extending, you worked with them for 3 years under the Canada-Colombia FTA and now you're doing it again, right? Even if you're on an open work permit, PGWP, and now you're doing closed, that's technically, it's a new employer, okay? It's not the same employer, okay? Because the work permit will have a different employer on it. Instead of being open, it'll be closed. Put in full name, given names, family name as on the passport. Reference any previous forms that you've submitted to the government like this. Make sure they coincide. Did you tell them about your nickname or did you not? That's important. Or your maiden name if you've changed your name after marriage. Again, this person's single, but make sure that it's consistent on what you've submitted and keep a consistency with it. And get that information from your passport. Sex, date of birth, place of birth. I like to match that to the passport. And country or territory, citizenship. Of course, this person is going to be Colombia. Current, territory residence, Canada. We can't change this because it is 5710. It's for somebody who's already in Canada. So they're going to say, what is your status right now? And if you are a student but you're working, you would put student. And then, right? But if they're wondering, you've showed us pay stubs and a reference letter from the current employer you're working with that says you have the ability to do this work, you'd want to provide a letter of explanation and then say, hey, look, I'm a student, but I've been able to work part-time. Okay, so this person, we're saying for all intents and purposes, they're a PGWP and they were expiring sometime in, I can't believe I just typed June. Let's say, was it June 6th? And then this would be, 2024. 06. Previous countries or territories. During the past 5 years, if you lived in any other country other than your country of citizenship, which is Colombia, or your current country of territory residence, Canada. So if in the last 5 years you've either lived in Colombia or Canada, it would be no. And then this gets blanked out. This person is, single. Okay. No. I'll remind you that common law means you've lived with someone in a marriage-like relationship for 1 year. Native language, mother tongue, this should be Spanish. And then you've got ability to communicate in English or French. English, French, if you put both, you'll have this becomes mandatory. Which one are you better at? Okay. Yes, you've taken a designated IELTS, hopefully. Passport, obviously make sure that matches your valid passport. Country or territory of issue. Even if you got it issued in Ottawa at like the consulate or the embassy, I've always said this and I'll say it time and time again. This is a poorly worded question. This should be basically the country in which the passport is from, like was issued by. They say that here, but a lot of people get confused because it'll say like issued at Ottawa, and then they're like, oh, they put Canada. No, it means like what's it on what passport do you have? So this would be Colombia, okay? Even if it was reissued in Canada. Issue date, this, expiry date, that. National identity document, I believe Colombians can have a national identity. You'd want to put that in. If you don't have an expiry date listed and they're expecting one, because it's mandatory, you can just put that, 3000-0101. As they've mentioned on one of their help center articles. USPR card, no. Contact information. If you're applying from within Canada and you're applying for a work permit, they're going to be sending it to your mailing address. So make sure that this is correct. Put in the apartment and the street number and the street name, Fifth Avenue, Toronto, Canada, Ontario, postal code. Residential address, if that's where you're living, then yes. If you have a hard time receiving residential mail, or you're like living in a basement or a suite number and maybe you can't receive mail, I don't know, or you're in between places, consider this will take from within Canada 4 to 5 months to get approved. So you want to make sure that the mailing address will be one that you can receive a work permit at, okay? So sometimes I put this as my mailbox as a consultant, or you can put it at a stable address where you know, so that your work permit's not going to get lost. Okay. And then email address, you put that in, put in your telephone number. I think that's mandatory. Alternate, not mandatory. Date and place of original entry to Canada. Some people get hung up on this one. Original means like original. When was the first time you set foot in this country? So let's say you came as a visitor when you were 3 years old with your parents to come to Ottawa in like 1993. You should put that as your original place of entry, okay? Or the original date. And then for the original place, the place is like, you want to be as descriptive as possible. So don't just use the country, Canada. Don't use the province. Don't just use the city. Use the specific port of entry. Vancouver International Airport. It could be a marine port of entry in Vancouver. It could be one of the 10 different land crossings in British Columbia. So put the exact place. Was it the Peace Bridge in Ontario? Peace Bridge. And then you could say, oh yeah, that's Fort Erie, right? Ontario. The original purpose of coming to Canada, let's say it was tourism. That's the original. Like when you first came and visited to come to Ottawa when you were 3 years old. Most recent entry is exactly as it sounds. Your most recent entry. When did you most recently enter? Did you come from Colombia, enter at Toronto Pearson Airport, right? YYZ? Or was that when you came in the second time and then you just quickly took a trip down to New York with your buddies and then you entered at the land port, right? It would be the most recent, the last time you came in. And that's sometimes hard to know because they don't always stamp passports these days. Document number. I've shown this on the BOWP application where to find the document number on a work permit, but it is the one below the red number. So if I type in work permit specimen, it usually starts with U. This is older looking one. It's not the red. It's not this one. Yeah, it's not this. It's this. It's the black one. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. It's not the red one that's embossed. It's this black one here. That's your permit number. And same thing with study. There's your permit number. Okay? So that's the one you're going to want to include. And I think if you try to include the other one, it won't allow you because it has a wrong amount of characters. So you put in the document number. Type of work permit you're applying for. This is exemption from labor market impact assessment. And when you do that now, it's going to want to know the name of your employer. What did they put in their offer of employment, right? They probably put their actual, like there's a difference between like a legal company name and then a trade name. So you want that to be consistent, right? Is it McDonald's Canada Corporation? If it's McDonald's, no, it's probably like 284576 Ontario Limited doing business as McDonald's, right? So make sure you get the name of employer correct. The complete address of the employer. This would be the business address and the one that they put in the offer of employment, which is why you, through the employer portal, which is why you need that information from your employer. That would be the business address, right? Like where the records address, the address that's on file with the CRA, because you also have then the option for intended location of employment. That's where you're going to be working. So that would be like the office that you work from, right? Or the McDonald's location that you're working at. Occupation in Canada will be job title. They've already put your job title in your offer of employment, so it should match. If they put construction estimator or any of the other example titles, this should match. Brief description of duties. You have like less than a sentence to put this in before you run out of space. So try and condense that down to make it as brief as possible. But if you want some inspiration, in your offer of employment, they would have put your job duties that you're going to be doing. So try and condense those job duties if possible. But like I said, it's less than a sentence of space that you can put there. So in many cases, it might just be kind of like the lead statement. So analyzing the costs of estimates on civil engineering, whatever. This probably is all we can fit in there. Let's see. Okay. Something like this. Brief description of duties. You don't need to say construction estimators, right? So that's kind of redundant. You've already said that's what your title is going to be. So you'd say analyze costs of and prepare estimates on civil engineering projects in residential domain. Maybe residential and commercial. See? So you've got to be as specific as you can without conflicting with what was submitted. But that's where you put your brief description. Duration of expected employment. They put this from and to in your offer of employment. The employer did. So they should match up. And like I said, usually go the from date. It can vary depending on processing times, right? I usually go a month or two out. You would want this to match. You don't want to be saying, I expect to work 3 years, but the employer only gave you 1 year offer, right? So you want that to match up. This is your A number, which will be like A. One less. Okay. No education. Yeah, put in your highest level of education. And then employment. This should have been on, again, a previous application for your PGWP or for your, you want that to be consistent. Okay. And then background information. Answer that all correctly. Okay. And always watch out for this one. 2B, have you ever been refused a visa or permit, denied entry, ordered to leave Canada or any other country or territory? Which means if you applied for a U.S. visa and got refused, put yes. Okay? Actually, that happened. One of my clients was refused, and I said, I mentioned it, and then his work permit was approved. So I said, yeah, you've got to mention the fact that you were refused from the U.S. that one time. Even though you now have a valid U.S. visa, that's something you always want to declare these questions truthfully. Okay, and then I always say consent to their surveys or whatever. Type your name. You don't have to, but type your name and the date. And then once you validate, if you filled out everything correctly and all the dates check out, like you don't have a date that's in the past or on a certain field where you're not supposed to, it'll say validated, yes, and then save this form. It'll be secured, and then you can upload that to the portal. So that should, and once you submit this at this point in time, within the next couple days, you should get a interim authorization to work, which will say, hey, if you're currently on work status, which will basically enable you to extend your health insurance and other things like that, that as you've maintained your status. Okay. So I hope that was descriptive. And I showed you as much as I possibly could for the example of a construction estimator. And thank you for watching. Thank you for tuning in. Please comment. Let me know what more you want to see. If you need any clarification, try and ask questions as much as you can on YouTube, on my channel. It drives engagement. It helps more people to find my channel. It helps me to continue to put out valuable content like this. And it enables other people to learn from it. So it's a more collaborative approach, holds me accountable to giving correct answers. Okay. And then of course, if you want a personalized consultation, you can book a meeting with me, or you can book an application review, or if you want full representation, I'm happy to do that too. So thank you all again for tuning in. Make sure you like and subscribe, share this video, and thank you so much.